Welcome to the debate. Today, we're diving into one of the most persistent and frankly critical assessments facing the BL genre. We're talking about the inclusion and, well, the romanticization of character archetypes that are often defined by behaviors lumped under the banner of toxic masculinity. You know the ones, the possessive lead, the emotionally repressed executive, the cold, mysterious senior.
Exactly. And the central question we're tackling is this. Does featuring these behaviors so often primarily harm representation by, normalizing unhealthy relationships? Or, on the other hand, does it actually serve a necessary, almost cathartic narrative function that's built around conflict, transformation, and that big emotional payoff at the end?
I'm arguing that the persistent romanticization of these, well, controlling and emotionally unavailable behaviors reinforces some really outdated power fantasies. I think it carries potentially damaging social consequences by shaping audience expectations, especially when that behavior isn't clearly and consistently challenged within the story itself.
And I'm coming at this from a different angle. I maintain that these deeply flawed characters are absolutely essential for creating narrative tension and achieving a genuine emotional payoff. For the audience, the focus isn't on admiring the flaw itself, but on admiring the journey out of it. We see these flaws not as a model for real life, but as narrative symbols for complex issues like trauma or societal repression.
Okay, so let's get right to the heart of the critique. The concern over toxic masculinity in BL is, I think, fundamentally valid because the genre so consistently leans on these types, the domineering boss, the cold older love interest, the jealous protector, and these characters risk blurring a really critical line between romantic tension and, well, actual emotional manipulation. We see it constantly. Unilateral decisions, physical aggression that's sort of masked as passion, or an extreme possessiveness that just strips the other character of their autonomy.
Mm-hmm.
And this isn't just about what makes a good story. It's about the social consequences. When a story treats controlling tendencies or, emotional stonewalling as charming, or just makes it look hot, it really risks glamorizing traits that cause genuine harm in real-world LGBTQ+ relationships. The problem gets so much worse when the narrative lets the controlling character get away with it, without facing any real consequences. It suggests that putting up with unhealthy behavior is the road to true love. And that is just a harmful message. I really think the genre has to evolve past this.
I see why you think that, I really do, but I think focusing only on the harmful message kind of misses the entire point of genre fiction. I mean, writing a flawed character is not the same thing as endorsing that flaw. The very engine of BL, especially the really successful series, is transformation. It's built on these incredibly satisfying structures like enemies to lovers, or the hurt-comfort arc. We're dealing with characters whose initial state, their coldness, their rigidity, is a structural necessity to create any kind of narrative stakes.
Right.
The audience is drawn to the journey toward emotional maturity, not the starting point. Think about that classic cold lead who, after, a dozen episodes, finally offers a genuine, unprompted smile or a vulnerable confession. Watching that emotionally frozen character soften and become truly vulnerable, that provides a deeply satisfying, a profoundly cathartic payoff. And besides, the behaviors you're criticizing often function as powerful metaphors. They can symbolize the emotional walls built by queer men living under immense pressure, whether it's from internalized homophobia or past trauma. If you don't start from a flawed place, there is simply no room for growth, and so no compelling story. The flaw is the prerequisite for the catharsis.
I completely agree that growth is the engine of drama. But this brings us to our first major point of disagreement: accountability and framing. My concern is less about the fact that the flawed character exists and far more about how the narrative positioned itself towards that flaw.
Okay.
So let's take a concrete example. The forced confession or, the public declaration of ownership by the controlling lead. If the writing frames this as a romantic high point where the other character is just swept off their feet by this overwhelming desire, that is damaging romanticization. The critical difference is whether the writing actually holds that character accountable for the power dynamic they're creating, or if it just dismisses the consequences under the guise of intense love.
Sure.
I mean, if the possessive CEO who spent the whole series manipulating his partner's life gets forgiven with a single tearful apology in the final scene, that is not genuine accountability. That's just prioritizing a shallow power fantasy, the idea of being desired so intensely that rules don't apply, over modeling healthy respect. The story has to show the aggression or the control as something tragic, something that actively harms the relationship, not just some charming quirk that the other person has to patiently put up with.
I understand the skepticism, especially about that last-minute redemption, but I think we need to look closer at the intention behind the emotional journey. If the narrative successfully shows the character actually grappling with their flaws, if they have to lose something important, like their partner's trust or their own sense of self-control to realize the damage they've caused, then those initial toxic traits just function as necessary dramatic hurdles.
But do they always?
Well, the problem isn't the flaw, it's lazy execution. When it's done well, the possessiveness isn't just for show, it's a setup for its own critique and correction later on. The emotional cost of keeping up that cold exterior is often the real focus of the drama. For instance, in a lot of these stories, the possessive character ends up isolating themselves. Their inability to communicate causes all this pain. That internal suffering is a form of accountability. They suffer because of their flaw, and the journey is watching them learn how to suffer less by becoming vulnerable. That struggle is what provides the depth for the transformation.
It's a compelling point about internal suffering, but let me just push back on whether that's enough. If a character's internal struggle mostly shows up as external control over their partner, then the narrative is still putting the burden of that struggle and the burden of fixing them onto the victim.
I'm not sure I'd call them a victim in every case.
When we talk about accountability, we need an external relational reckoning. Does the partner ever effectively say no to the possessive behavior? Does the narrative ever actually pause to acknowledge the fear or discomfort that's being caused? Too often, the quieter partner's patience is framed as the key to the other's redemption, which is a classic unhealthy trope. The story celebrates the one who endures rather than critiquing the one who inflicts. And that's where the harm is, no matter what the writer's intention was. We need stories where that initial imbalance is shown to be genuinely painful and is challenged, not just, endured as the price of admission for the happy ending.
But this is where the specificity of the genre comes in. You're applying a very clear-cut, almost Western therapeutic standard of accountability to a narrative structure that relies on intense emotional metaphor and high drama. If a character's oppression is so deep they can't say, "I love you," then possessiveness becomes their desperate, flawed way of trying to secure the relationship. If the story shows, even quickly, that the character has to apologize, or lose the relationship, or dismantle their entire self-image to evolve, then the initial traits are the essential starting point. To insist on a moment-by-moment punishment for every misstep risks, well, flattening the drama and losing the very intensity that the audience came for, the intensity of watching a tightly wound character finally just break open. And this brings me to our second central point. I think there's a misunderstanding of the trope itself. I'd argue that what gets so quickly labeled toxic masculinity is often just an exaggerated emotional archetype that BL has used for decades as a dramatic tool. Playing with contrasts, sun versus moon, aggressive versus compliant.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that every cold lead is reinforcing some kind of real social harm. And here's why. These characters are often performing masculinity. They're high-status figures, CEOs, athletes, who are under immense pressure from society or their families. They're often closeted and terrified of being vulnerable. So this emotional coldness, it's a defense mechanism. It's a performance, not genuine toxicity aimed at just hurting someone.
A performance with real consequences, though.
But think of the classic rigid semi-role, especially in older Japanese or Thai series. His stiff posture, his formal way of speaking, his need to control everything, that is a visual representation of his emotional wall. And when that performance finally shatters and he's reduced to this genuine, messy vulnerability, the emotional release is so powerful because the initial structure was so rigid. It's about demonstrating growth, not validating harmful behavior. It's the story of a man learning to stop performing and actually start feeling.
That's an intellectually appealing way to frame it as a societal performance. But I'm just not convinced that the writer's intention to show a performance gets rid of the effect of that performance on the audience or on the other character in the story.
Okay, what the effect is part of the drama.
The issue is this: if the external behavior, the possessiveness, the manipulation, shapes audience expectations in unhealthy ways, then calling it a trope or a performance doesn't give the narrative a free pass. The audience is still watching a situation where person A treats person B poorly, and the story implies that this suffering is a necessary price for a desirable partner. We have to be really wary of defining things that are real-world issues, like jealousy or emotional stonewalling, as just fictional storytelling devices. I mean, where do you draw the line? If a character is performing cruelty, the cruelty is still real for the person on the receiving end.
But the line is drawn by what happens next in the story. If the character is performing control because they are afraid, the story is successful if it ultimately shows the audience that the source of the fear is internal and the solution is vulnerability, not more control. That's the difference between a trope that's just there to look cool, which I agree is poor writing, and a trope that serves as the foundation for a complex character arc.
I appreciate that distinction, but I find that so many popular series fall right into that aestheticization trap. They give us the possessive action, the sudden kiss, the cold dismissal, and then follow it with an explanation rooted in trauma, using that trauma as a shield against any real critique. It's the "I hurt you because I love you" defense, which is a fundamentally unhealthy idea.
I think you're underestimating the audience's ability to see nuance.
I just demand conceptual clarity. If the behavior involves emotional manipulation that causes real distress to the partner, then it is problematic. And the genre has to make sure that behavior is ultimately portrayed as a flaw to be corrected, not just dramatic part of a romance. The genre thrives on transformation, I agree, but that transformation is only meaningful if the starting point is truly recognized as damaging, not just dramatically interesting.
But the fantasy of control is often dismantled by the narrative itself. It shows the emotional exhaustion and isolation that comes with keeping that wall up. That process is the catharsis. The genre is great at showing us the inner mechanics of vulnerability, and sometimes the only way to get there is to a dramatic breaking point that's fueled by that initial intense control. If we only focus on the bad behavior in the first act, we miss the whole point of the third act's earned emotional connection.
And my core concern remains anchored in representation. Unless the writing is incredibly intentional and consistently critiques the behavior, allowing the partner genuine agency and forcing the aggressor into authentic reckoning, the risk of reinforcing damaging patterns, I think, outweighs the potential for catharsis. The line between dramatic tension and romanticized control is just exceptionally thin, and too often the narrative leans to the dangerous side of it.
I'd argue that the complexity of the genre means what some see as toxicity can also be seen as vulnerability in disguise, a deep fear that the character has to overcome to achieve connection. While badly written stories fail at this, the potential is there for these characters to be complex, broken, and learning, and to become these really potent vehicles for catharsis.
The critical question should always be, is the narrative allowing the character to actually grow, or is it romanticizing control simply for aesthetic tension, letting them keep their power despite their actions? I think understanding this material requires looking beyond the surface tension to assess the narrative accountability offered by the story's complete arc.
And I believe understanding this genre requires reading its intent charitably, acknowledging that transformation is the goal, and that the greatest catharsis comes from the greatest initial struggle. We have to look at what the genre aspires to be, a space for flawed men to become better partners, and judge the execution on that aspiration.
Ultimately, it is up to the listener to determine whether they're witnessing a genuine critique of unhealthy behavior or just its celebration under the guise of passion. The material, I think we can agree, offers strong arguments for both interpretations, depending entirely on the individual story's commitment to consequence.
Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing. It really helps the channel grow. See you in the next one.